Happy Mother's Day to all your mothers. Thank you. No doubt KFC will be doing a good trade today. We got a package during the week from Jim and Norica Homes. You might remember Jim visited us a couple of times. Jim's an Irishman who lives in Japan, and he and Norica were recently back in Ireland, and they got a postcard and they put a message on it, and I'm not sure what to do with it. If I pin it one way you can't read the message, if I pin it the other way you can't see the pictures. But anyway, I'll just read it, and it's a very short message. It just says, just a word of thanks for your prayers when we needed them. With blessings, Jim and Norica, and that's addressed to the congregation. So somehow, if you want to see the glories of Ireland, somehow you'll be able to do that. But today I follow a tradition that I began many years ago. On Father's Days and Mother's Days, I've always made it a habit to speak about things pertaining to either fathers or mothers, and so I want to do today. By now, over the years, I've preached my way right through the various passages that are relevant. But in regard to Mother's Day, there's one Bible character whom I've avoided, and that is Hannah, the mother of Samuel. And the reason that I've avoided her is because there's seemingly so little said about her. We've just got a couple of chapters, and she only had Samuel as a son to herself for a couple of years. So I've tended to think, well, there's not much I can say in regard to her. But I've also made it my aim, particularly in recent years, to speak about passages that I haven't touched on before. And so that combination made me sort of say to myself, well, I'm going to do Hannah and go through it. And you can read about her in the first couple of chapters of Samuel, and that's where we're going to be this morning. This fits into the latter years of the time of the judges before Israel had a king. And it was a troubled time because Israel kept drifting away from God, and God used other nations to make Israel wake up to itself. Hannah went for a long time without being able to bear children, and so eventually she prayed to God, and God granted her a child. In fact, in all, she was to have 6 children. But her first child is the one that we're focusing upon, and his name, of course, was Samuel. It was he who would eventually lead Israel from the time of the judges through to the time of the kings, the first king being Saul. And this fits into the 11th century BC. So we have Hannah, beginning here in 1 Samuel 1 verse 1, as the wife of a man named Elkanah. He was an Israelite. He lived in the territory of Ephraim. At that time, God still tolerated polygamy, and thus it was that Elkanah had 2 wives, one of them being Peninnah, and she had children. The other wife was Hannah, who had at this stage no children. And year after year, Peninnah makes Hannah's life miserable. You read down here in 1 Samuel 1 and verse 6, her rival, in other words, that means Hannah's rival, Peninnah, moreover, would provoke her bitterly to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. And it happened year after year, as often as she went up to the house of the Lord, that she would provoke her. So she wept and would not eat. And so there's a good reason not to have polygamy. But eventually, on one of the visits to Shiloh to worship, Hannah prays to God, prays desperately for a child. Her rival wife, if you like, drives her to that. As I just said, this Shiloh is where they went each year to offer sacrifices to God. Shiloh was situated to the north of Bethel in the tribal territory of Ephraim, and the tabernacle was situated there from the time when Israel conquered the land of Canaan, and it remained there until eventually the temple was built in Jerusalem. Elkanah would take his 2 wives and they would go there, and it was on one of those trips that Hannah prayed, and I pick it up in 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 9. Then Hannah got up after eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the temple of the Lord, and that's relevant a bit further down in this chapter. She, that's Hannah, greatly distressed, prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. And she made a vow and said, Lord of armies, some of you will have Lord of hosts there, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your bondservant and remember me, and not forget your bondservant, but will give your bondservant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and a razor shall never come on his head. Now notice there, she says, if God will give her a son, she will dedicate him to the Lord all his days. And then she adds, through all of his life, a razor will never come on his head. What's that got to do with anything? Well, that's the relevance of the passage that Ken just read to you a while ago in Numbers chapter 6. This idea of not shaving one's head was linked to the Levirate vow, the Nazarite vow, and as a sign of dedication to the Lord, this was a time when a person focused upon the Lord and committed themselves to the Lord, and as a mark of that, they didn't cut their head at all, they didn't shave their head, but just let their hair grow for the length of the vow. The Illustrated Bible Dictionary gives this definition of somebody who made such a vow. In Israel, the Nazarite was one who separated himself from others by consecration to Yahweh, in other words to God, with a special vow. But if you read on from Numbers 6 and verse 13, you'll see that the Nazarite vow was made for a specified time. And then, when that time was fulfilled, there was a procedure to be followed, bringing the time of the vow to an end and allowing the individual to continue on with their normal life. And part of that process of bringing the vow to an end was cutting one's head. But you see here in Hannah's vow, she says of her son, if God gives her one, A razor shall never come on his head. In other words, he will be dedicated to God for the rest of his life. So she was committing her son to lifelong service and dedication to God. Well, God went on to grant Hannah's prayer. And in time she gave birth to a son whom she named Samuel. Now, I said a while ago, Hannah usually accompanied her husband each year to Shiloh for the annual sacrifice. But after Samuel's birth for some years, she instead stays home with the infant Samuel, and she gives her reasons for this in chapter 1, verse 21 and following. Then the man Elkanah went up with all his household to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and to pay his vow. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, I will not go until the child is weaned. Then I will bring him so that he may appear before the Lord and stay there for life. Elkanah, her husband, said to her, do what seems best to you. Stay until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord confirm his word. So the woman stayed and nursed her son until she weaned him. I read several sources on this, and there was general agreement that in the East it was the custom to nurse a child for the first 3 years of their life and then to wean them at the age of 3. And so the indication is that Hannah fulfills her vow when Samuel is 3 years old. I struggled with that because you think, well, giving a 3-year-old child to the priesthood and those of the tabernacle, it seems a bit hard to imagine that, but I've gone over these few chapters again and again, and there's nothing to say otherwise. There's nothing to say there was a long gap between Samuel being weaned and him being given to the tabernacle of the temple, as it's referred to here. When he was weaned, she gave him into the care of the priesthood. And of course that is a fulfillment of what she vowed, that she would devote him to the Lord for his life. 1 Samuel chapter 1 and 24, now when she had weaned him, she took him up with her with a 3-year-old bull, 1 ephah of flour, and a jug of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord in Shiloh, although the child was young. Then they slaughtered the bull and brought the bull to Eli, the priest. And she said, pardon me, my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. For this boy I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my request which I asked of him. So I have also dedicated him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is dedicated to the Lord, and he worshipped the Lord there. So she gives him to the service of the Lord, just as she had promised. Again, well, was he really that young? Well, if you look at chapter 2 and verse 19, you'll read this. His mother would make for him a little robe and bring it up to him from year to year. So he was still a young, small child, and she would make for him a little robe. And, what's so difficult about that? You could say he's going to be placed in the care of the priest, but the priest wasn't a very good father. Eli is the priest that gets talked about here. In chapter 1 and verse 3, you read that he has 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, and the Bible doesn't give a good report about them. Chapter 2 and verse 12, now the sons of Eli were useless men and did not know the Lord. Verse 17, And so the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for the men treated the offering of the Lord disrespectfully. In verse 22, now Eli was very old, and he heard about everything that his sons were doing in all Israel, and that they slept with the women who served at the doorway of the tent of meeting. And then if you take the time to read chapter 3, verses 10 through to 13, God addresses Eli and points out his sins, and one of them is that he didn't really rebuke his sons for their behaviour. So not a great father, and this is the one who is going to be there for Hannah's son Samuel. So you think this is not looking good, but on the other hand, we did notice in chapter 1 and verse 22 that there were women who served at the doorway of the tent of meeting. Now, what sort of women they were remains a question, but you know, at least there were women there, and it wouldn't be right to assume that there was nobody decent in the service of the tabernacle. I'm sure God would have been involved in all of this, and remember, Hannah's giving her young child. I imagine that she and her husband, in their visits over the years, had looked at the situation that was there. So Hannah does what she promised she would do. Again, I thought about this, 3-year-old child, and I went back and, I've got notes about my family's background and so forth. It seems that I started what was called nursery school when I was 4 years old. So I was kind of young when, I was put in the care of a school. And also, when you think about it today, children going to long day care much earlier than the age of 3. You've got children going to long day care sometimes in their first year. So this situation is not, shall I say, completely unusual, even from our own perspective in today. So she has done what she said to the Lord she was going to do, but she hasn't completely lost contact with him. We read just a while ago in chapter 2 and verse 19 that each year thereafter, as she came with her husband to worship at Shiloh, she would make Samuel a robe. And the question is, well, how long did she stay on those trips? I'm sure both mum and dad would have wanted to spend some time with their son. And also the distance was not all that great. From doing some rough estimates, looking at a map and so forth, it would seem at the most they were only about 25 kilometres away, perhaps less than that. So it is feasible that in one way or another there might have been contact through the course of the year. I don't know. But I'm going to say that Samuel didn't live in complete isolation. Let's put it that way. Whilst he was still young, Samuel started serving in the temple or tabernacle, whichever word you want to use here. Chapter 2 and verse 11, then Elkanah the father went to his home at Ramah, but the boy continued to attend to the service of the Lord before Eli the priest. Verse 18, now Samuel was ministering before the Lord as a boy wearing a linen ephod, that's a garment it's a garment worn on the upper body. Chapter 3 and verse 1, now the boy Samuel was attending to the service of the Lord before Eli. And then we go on further into chapter 3. God begins to communicate with Samuel. First of all, giving Samuel a message regarding Eli and his sons and their behaviour. And that communication between God and Samuel was going to continue through Samuel's life, because Samuel becomes recognised as a prophet. If you look at chapter 3 verses 19 to 21, and also if you look at chapter 7 verses 15 through to 17, Samuel served as a judge throughout his life, and he would use Ramah, his place of birth, as a starting place, and he would do a circuit, as I said, serving as a judge. It was through Samuel that God introduced, if you like, its first king to Israel, Saul, and God also used Samuel to address King Saul when Saul started making mistake after mistake, and God used Samuel again to anoint David to be the person who would replace Saul as king of Israel. So Samuel goes on to a life dedicated to God. What about his mother Hannah? Well, we go back to chapter 2 and verse 21. The Lord indeed visited Hannah, and she conceived and gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the boy Samuel grew up before the Lord. So in all, she went on to have 6 children altogether. As I said in my introduction, when you think Hannah is largely limited to just a few mentions in 2 chapters of 1 Samuel, I've taken the view in the past that, well, there's not much I could say about her if I was to preach a sermon about her as a mother. But in fact, once we go through this, once I went through these chapters a number of times and looked at them more closely, I realised that in fact there's quite a bit that the book of 1 Samuel says about Hannah as a mother. Certainly the fact that we've just read that she had 5 more children, meaning 6 children in all, would say that she certainly had full experience of being a mother. She raised Samuel, at least for the first 3 years of his life, and then maintained contact with him, and then she had 5 more children and she raised them. So she knew about being a mother. But also, if we look at the first few chapters, there's some very positive qualities about this lady that makes her an example in regard to motherhood. Number 1, Hannah, before she was a mother, was committed to God. For instance, it tells us here that year by year, chapter 1 verse 7, she went up to the house of the Lord in Shiloh with her husband. Now you could say, well, okay, but he might have been forcing her to do so. Or she might have just done it because that was the social custom. But certainly she wasn't forced. That's one thing we see with her husband Elkanah in 2 regards. Number 1, she vows, if God gives her a son, to give that son to the care of the Lord. Elkanah could have put a stop to that vow. That was, if a lady was married and she made a vow and her husband found out about it, he could put a stop to that vow. He didn't. He himself went along with her regarding that vow. Also in chapter 1, beginning in verse 21, when she says, I won't go with you, I'll stay home until such time as I've weaned Samuel. Again, Elkanah doesn't get upset with her and force her to come along. He again goes along with her decision. She wasn't under compulsion to go to the annual feasts. So we can't say that she just did it out of compulsion to her husband, or that she did it even because it was a social custom, because she also showed herself to individually pray to God. We saw that in chapter 1, beginning in verse 10, that she prayed in her desire for a child. And then if you go on and look at chapter 2, verses 1 through to 10, she prays in thanksgiving once she has a child, and this is a spiritually mature prayer. It shows a considerable depth to it. So this was, by all indications, a lady who was committed to God. And from the point of view of motherhood, we can certainly say if you want to raise your children to be committed to God, then it certainly helps if their mother and their father, of course, are also committed to God. And that having been carried out, if you like, even before children are born. So number one, she was committed to God. Number two, she had married a godly man. And if you go through chapters 1 and 2, you're given the impression that that Elkanah was a good husband and a godly husband, that he, year by year, he worshipped God, and he himself was willing to go with Hannah and dedicate their first son to God. Now, I can't say that a Christian woman married to a husband who is not a believer cannot raise godly children, because after all, Timothy's mother, Eunice, raised Timothy to be a follower of God, and yet Eunice, it says, was married to a Greek, to a Gentile. He was neither Jew nor Christian, but she still raised him, Timothy, to be a godly child. But I will say this, from 50 years of observation, that when you marry somebody who is not concerned about God, it's going to make things more difficult. Not simply in regard to raising your children to follow God, but even in regard to you yourself continuing to follow God. Because quite often you see somebody, a young woman, marry outside the church and fall away. And I've seen that happen many, many times. So the fact that Hannah was married to a godly man is very significant. A third point here is that Hannah had faith in God. You see that, chapter 1, verses 10 and 11. She had faith when she prayed to God, asking God for a child. In fact, there's an interesting point that can be overlooked. She's praying earnestly and silent. Her lips are moving, but she's not actually saying something out loud. So Eli, the priest, is there near to her, and he thinks she's just rambling on in drunkenness, and he reprimands her. She says, "No, I'm not drunk. I'm pouring out my heart to the Lord." And so Eli says, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant your request that you have asked of him," in chapter 1 and verse 17. Now notice 1 and verse 18. She said, let your bondservant find favour in your sight. So the woman went on her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. She hadn't been given a child at that point. She wasn't even pregnant at that point. But just as a result of prayer and Eli expressing his good wishes, it says her face was no longer sad. I think another version says her face was no longer downcast or something to that effect. In other words, just praying earnestly to God gave her a lift. And that to me says she is a lady who has a faith. And, obviously that faith would have been made even stronger when she became pregnant and she had a child in fulfillment of her prayer. And consider too the faith it took to hand over a youngster to the priests and those who were involved in the running of the tabernacle or the temple. So she had faith, and obviously if she had faith, then she could demonstrate faith to her children. As her children grew up, they could see that she was a believer in God. The fourth point here from Hannah is that she kept her word. She said to the Lord, chapter 1, "If you will give me a child, I will devote him to you for life." Now, was that going to be easy? Remember, she hadn't had children. She desperately wanted children, and it appears that some years had gone by with her not having a child. And then she has the child, and she raises the child, nurses the child for 3 years, it appears, building the bond between her and the child. And there's no indication at this stage that there's the promise of more children. So this might not be just her first child, but as far as she knows, it might be her only child. And she's going to give the child to the care of the priest to be raised to serve God. That must have been a hard thing to do, and yet she kept her word. All right, so, what's positive about that? Well, her children will grow up seeing that she was serious about following God, and today a Christian woman who keeps her word, and particularly a word to God, and you made a commitment when you became a Christian. If you live by that, your children will grow up seeing that commitment and how it applies in various aspects of your life. So you'll be setting a positive example. Plus, this also is relevant to the mother's relationship with the child. I don't know about you, but I think most children, most of us as we grow up, remember times when Mum and Dad would either warn us and say, well, if you don't do that, something will happen to you. I'll deal with you. You've seen them at the shops or somewhere. Be quiet. I told you to be quiet. If you don't be quiet, and they go on and never do anything. Or you make promises to your children and you're never there to fulfill your children. What happens? Well, the children grow up thinking, well, your word means nothing. Your promises mean nothing. Your discipline means nothing. So they lack regard for you and for the husband if it's the same way. Children learn from experience. And when you say something to them and keep your word, they will grow up knowing that you are to be taken seriously and you mean what you say. So don't say things that you don't mean. Then a fifth point here is that Hannah aimed for her child to have a lifelong commitment to God. And we saw that in the vow that she made in chapter 1 and verse 11, and I'm reading the second half of that verse. I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and a razor, remember that symbolises the end of the vow, a razor shall never come to his head. In other words, he will always be devoted to God. And certainly she did what she could to fulfill that vow. At an early age, she gave Samuel into the circle of the priesthood for him to be raised as one who served God. And indeed, Samuel did serve God throughout his life, both as a prophet and also as a judge. And you say, yeah, but she had very little time with him to influence him. Well, and I've quoted these before, but in the literature I've got at home, it says the first couple of years are a crucial time of learning. There's things your child learns in those first couple of years that go with them through life. So she was with Samuel, Hannah was, at a crucial time. But also you can raise a child in a way to have a lifelong impact. Proverbs chapter 22 verse 6 is a well-known verse. Train up a child in the way he should go, even when he grows older, he will not abandon it. Now I know that verse raises a lot of questions, and I have talked about that verse in sermons and classes over the years. But what it's saying is you can have a lasting impact, and there are Christians I know today where I've known them from before they even got married, through having children and raising the children to be married and then have children of their own. And I've seen some couples who have been very effective parents in raising their children to be Christians. And certainly Hannah had that commitment herself to point her, not only Samuel, but as we see from her character, in all likelihood the next 5 children also, you could say that she would have really striven to point them in the right direction as well. So I come back to the introduction. For many years I avoided speaking about Hannah because I just didn't think I would be able to make much of a sermon from her concerning motherhood. But finally, when I got around to this year and said, okay, who do I preach about this year in regard to motherhood? I said, okay, let's have a look at Hannah. And I did. And when I really looked at her and really thought about it, I thought, hey, there are some very positive qualities there. And really, there's a lesson for all of us, male and female, in this. You know, I looked at Hannah. I read my Bible right through every year, and teach on it and so forth. And yes, I've come across Hannah many, many times. And I just thought, well, there's only a couple of chapters, not a great deal. But then I realised with close examination, hey, there are some very positive things about Hannah. And that's the thing with the Bible. We can look at parts of the Bible and think, well, there's nothing much there. Or, unfortunately, even Christians sometimes, like people in the world, will say, I haven't got time for the Bible. I haven't got time to sit down and read it every day. I just don't see how it's going to be helping me in my life with job and family and mortgage and all of this sort of thing. But there's a whole lot more there of practical value if we will only take the time to treat it seriously and spend time with it. I've said many times, the indication is a lot of Christians do not read their Bibles. We need to change that. in our own lives. But coming back to mothers, what can we say we can observe from Hannah? Number one, Hannah was committed to God even before she became a mother. Number two, Hannah married a godly man before she became a mother. Number three, Hannah had faith in God both before and after becoming a mother. Number four, Hannah as a mother kept her word. And number five, Hannah, even before she became a mother, aimed for her child to have a lifelong commitment to God. She had goals in her life and she worked towards those goals. And those are all principles which remain relevant today for Christian mothers. And let's remember, you're not on our own, because a Christian father should be involved as well. It should be a team effort. The outcome was that God blessed Hannah. Now, God blessed Hannah by giving her 5 more children. I think if I said to some here, you're going to have 5 more children, you might not think of that as a blessing. Today we tend, for various reasons, to want smaller families. But God still promises blessing to mothers. 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse... not 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 5, but verse 15. But women will be preserved through childbirth if they continue in faith, love and sanctity with moderation. Some versions will say women will be saved through childbirth. Now there's various views of what that means, and it doesn't mean you're spiritually saved just by having a child. Because even here it says, if they continue in faith, love and sanctity with moderation, self-control. But God is saying that I will take care of you. Even though in the context there might be some tasks that you don't carry out because you're focused on being a woman and being a mother and so forth. Nevertheless, God will bless you in your role as a mother, just as he blesses all Christians who serve him. So God will bless you as a mother. And fathers need to be supportive of that role. As I just said, it needs to be a team effort. So Hannah, along with other women in the Bible, does provide an example of positive attitudes, of positive qualities that a Christian woman as a wife and mother can have. So the message is the Bible applies to every role of life, including parenthood, and God doesn't put mothers down. God blesses mothers, and God will look after you, and there is much that you can achieve in that part of your life where you're a mother. There's other parts of your life where you can achieve other things as well. But when you have children, then what should be our goal? To raise those children as much as we can to follow God. So that's the encouragement today. This is Mother's Day. I hope you have an enjoyable day and enjoy your KFC, if that's what it's going to be. Yeah, we get the Bible message is, look, things are about eternity and salvation. And that should govern every part of our lives, including our lives as parents. Let's stand and sing.